Good afternoon, folks. Once again, we are live and up and running. Let me get everything switched over to the jam stream layout. We'll do some audio checks and we will get started with today's Beatbox jam stream. Let me put this up here. There we go. I got everything loaded. I'm going to throw on a real quick loop I put together while the stream was loading. And we'll kind of talk through the plan for today, and we will jump right in. I was messing around with some string organ combinations as I was putting this together when everything was loading. Very simple, but I'm hoping we can kind of take some of these ideas and flow them over to the BGM stuff when we get there. Being very close to Halloween, when we eventually work on BGM stuff, I want to focus on trying to do spooky stuff today. And so this is sort of a way to get the juices flowing a little bit. But before that, what are we going to talk about today on the jam stream? So for the beatbox technique and sound theory part of the discussion, I wanted to spend today talking a little bit about some ideas and concepts around practicing for speed, which is something we've touched on in the past. We've talked a little bit about it as it comes to technicality specifically, but I want to sort of expand that discussion out a little bit to cover regular techniques and composition stuff, in addition to just, the fast speed patterns where you're chaining together individual sounds in the set to get quote unquote fast sounding combinations. And I think it'll have a little bit of carryover as far as the topic goes, since we'll talk about technicality and how it weaves in. But I kind of wanted to bring up some examples that were outside of just technicality when it comes to practicing beatboxing for speed. So that'll be the main focus of the technique and sound theory discussion. We'll talk about kind of some recommendations for the practice and applying these ideas in order to boost speed and work on getting faster and more consistent when it comes to putting sounds together, which is not really an angle I've approached when it comes to the topic of speed. So I'm hoping the conversation will be interesting for people who are interested in learning about beatboxing. But first up, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this off. Actually, not a bad beat, but because I had it recorded, the synth is hooked up. It's off right now, so I'm not getting feedback. But because I recorded it just with my mic boost on in the interest of getting something together quickly, it has a bunch of distortion on it, so I'm not going to actually keep it. So let me make sure it's blank and save. But we're going to start with warm-up, like we normally do. Just run through some quick freestyling beats, different types of sounds to get the blood flowing and get started. And then from there, we'll move into the technique, sound theory, and practice portion of the discussion where we'll be focusing on speed. And so it looks like everything sound-wise is all right. I will be keeping an eye on the audio readout to make sure my snares and whatnot aren't completely peaking the mic, but I think we're good for now. So we'll go ahead and get started. So yeah, let's warm up. All right. A little bit of an extended warm up, but I think that will do to get things started. We change my caption and we will move on to sound theory and practice and technique. There we go. Warm up is always interesting. I feel like I don't do a set sort of routine or set of routines whenever I'm doing warm up stuff. I try and just string together a bunch of freestyle beats that are going to exercise a bunch of different parts of the muscle anatomy on the face. Just again, get the blood flowing and make it a little bit easier to transition into doing the stuff that we're discussing in the technique and sound theory. But as far as dedicated drills and whatnot, I don't have a set amount of things that I use for warm up. Usually I'll start with simple beats and kind of work up in complexity. Since it's easier to do that once you're slightly warmed up versus completely cold, especially with the BGM snares. And I still have not quite found the sweet spot for getting the muscle anatomy in your face completely warmed up for BGM or spit snares. For me, it seems to just be kind of dependent on what I do, and then it warms up over time. But it's one of the few sounds I can't just get out of bed first thing in the morning and be able to do like a sharp spit snare really quickly. All the other ones that I know are pretty much not affected by warm-up status. So for the topic of technique, sound theory as it relates to beatboxing, I mentioned at the top of the stream that I wanted to focus a bit on the discussion of speed, and not just as it relates to technicality, but just speed training in general when it comes to practicing beatboxing and getting better over time. And thinking about how I sort of got into it, it's coming up on 4+ years ago, I think now, if I started in 2019. But like most people who got exposed to beatboxing through places like YouTube, I remember seeing videos of crazy stuff people doing, like the GBB main stage battling, and then routines and shout outs in different beatbox channels. Of course, Swiss Beatbox is one of the biggest ones for beatbox content. I don't really watch them as much nowadays just because I don't want to subconsciously rip off other artists that I see. But it's a really good avenue for looking at beatbox content and showcasing people out there in the scene. And so usually it would be some high-level beatboxers doing a video or something on a platform like that, showing off crazy techniques, be it a bass or a pattern or routine that the artist is featuring that has a lot of really interesting or compelling techniques. And I don't even remember which one it was, but I remember seeing a lot of the battle type stuff, seeing people go head to head and pulling out all their tools and techniques for battling on stage at a competitive level, and seeing how serious and impressive it was to hear these techniques and see them in real time, and not knowing how they're done, think, wow, that's insane that people can do that. And that ultimately motivated me to want to learn. And part of that is speed. Whether it's people showing off technicality, proficiency, or just working it into their actual materials so that it builds complexity and makes them sound more interesting. Usually, I think one of the things that pulls people in is either twofold, I think. When it comes to specific techniques that people tend to gravitate towards when they see it. One, I think, would be basses. You hear some of the pros out there like Inertia or Vocoder or D-Lo or B-Art or any of the other folks out there in the pro scene in, again, shout out videos or in a battle doing crazy bass technique. The outwards vocalized basses like your throat basses, vibration basses, vocalized chest, or the big one I think that gets the most eyes for someone completely new to beatboxing would be inward bass. It's very powerful, and when done correctly, it's strikingly distinct when it comes to a sound that you wish wouldn't hear if you were completely removed from the world of beatboxing. The second thing I think people tend to catch on to when they see people doing beatbox type material would be speed. I'm not saying it's universally these two things, but I think it's two things that people tend to pick up on really quick. If you're watching someone performing a routine and they're doing something, pretty straightforward. Again, this is just a sample of how you might see it in media. But let's say someone's doing just a simple beat and they're going like, and they start simple, but then they add something else in there, like we're going to talk about here with technicality, where it goes, etc. And all of a sudden your brain goes, okay, I'm listening to this person create this beat, and then all of a sudden there's all this other stuff that's thrown in really fast, and what was that? What was that combination of sound? How did they do that? And I think that distinct level of unique type of sound combination is, again, what a regular person is probably going to notice when they're just seeing beatboxing stuff for the first time. The trick is, and just based on my personal experience, when someone I know finds out that I can beatbox and they say, well, show us something really cool. To me, it's not really the best first impression just to do some like crazy technicality pattern. Someone says, oh, I heard you can beatbox. Can you show me something? I don't think I would just sit there and go, oh, how about if I do like a TKK pattern, like a... It might sound really weird and unusual, but it doesn't really have any context for beatboxing. It just sounds like a bunch of really fast, rapid sounds. And the person might say, well, that's really weird, but it doesn't really resonate. But if you take that and then you structure it into a beat, then the kind of context becomes a lot more clear. And I think it sounds more interesting to a person who's hearing it for the first time. So if you're going to do something like that, you're probably better off doing an actual mini routine or pattern that illustrates how it works instead of just busting out like a technique. It's kind of like, I guess, showing off a real complex talent without explaining what the talent is. And so you might do like a drum and bass pattern. You're like, oh, do you like drum and bass? And then, you kind of flesh out that speed and the technicality into something that actually sounds like music. Therefore, I think that comes across as more interesting, or at least more impressive. But even outside of that, if we're talking about just showing off, quote unquote, showing off beatboxing techniques to people who've never seen it, I think your average person is probably going to be more impressed by just a layering technique more than anything else. I don't know. I don't really encounter a lot of people, and not a lot of people out there in the real world in person. But if they were going to ask me to show off some sort of beatbox thing that I can do, I might just do a simple beat that has like a bass, a bunch of sounds and things layered together so that it's simple in practice, but it sounds more impressive, if that makes sense. Something just as easy as like a combination of sounds we've talked about here for layering, which would be like vocalized outward basses with some hats or some clicks and snares. So again, it's a bit of a tangent as far as what I think I would show off as part of the repertoire, but instead of doing like a real crazy speed pattern or something that someone who doesn't know beatboxing has really no context for, I might do something like and then maybe mix up some little variations with that kind of basic level of pattern construction, and then maybe flesh some stuff out, add like a lip roll or some other sounds. But I think you're gonna probably turn more heads with something like that than just a speed pattern or something that's fast for the sake of fast, because your average person probably isn't going to understand why it's impressive or why it's hard to do. But by the same token, I think because people just see these things that are physically impressive, it's what motivates them to want to learn more and kind of get into the whole medium of beatboxing. At least it was for me. And so for the discussion today, to kind of tie it all back to what we're going to talk about for technique and sound theory, speed, and the concept of speed as it relates to beatboxing in general, not just technicality. So what does that mean? I think based on just the way human anatomy works, for all you humans out there, it's pretty impossible without a high level of skill to be able to take an idea and then just do it fast. Most people who are completely new to something are going to need to learn from the ground up and start slow, and quite literally. And beatboxing is the same way. I think maybe with the exception of people who really want to prioritize competency and speed, and they go straight for the speed type practicing, and they do nothing but that. One of my favorite beatboxers that's pretty well known in the scene, he was last year's GBB champ from France, is a fella named Collapse. Very impressive beatboxer, well-rounded in pretty much every area of beatboxing when it comes to the type of sounds and techniques that he does. And he's an absolute monster of a beatboxer. But in his kind of content, I haven't checked on his YouTube channel in a bit, but he does YouTube videos and he kind of does his own thing too. He always stresses this idea of basics, which I think is a really important idea. And whenever I've talked to people who are interested in learning beatboxing, they say, where do you start? Where is the first place that I should go when it comes to learning everything? And we've kind of broken it down over the different jam streams here as well. I always say start with the basics. Yeah, it's kind of cool to see a really advanced technique like an inward lip roll or like a post snare or something that's really distinct. But it's going to be more difficult, I find, to learn all of those advanced things before you even have a knowledge of the basics. It's the very simple concept of learning to walk before you can run. And that's not to say you can't start learning them, but I think it's better just to start basic, get really comfortable and competent with constructing beats out of the simple tools, and then branch into the more complex stuff as you kind of build that competency. And speed's the same way too. Whenever it comes to taking an idea and giving it speed and making it like a fast pattern, be it micro pattern or expanding into a routine, a lot of times when I have an idea, for me personally, I'll take that idea and I'll start slow and kind of map out what I want to do, and then just practice it over and over again in a drill fashion until I get more comfortable with it, until it becomes more muscle memory, and then it just becomes faster naturally over time. And then you start pushing that idea faster, and it's a lot easier once you've kind of gotten into the habit of doing it slowly, consistently, and then the speed is sort of a transition thing that comes after that. So what's a good example of what I'm talking about? We were looking at like drum and bass routines and patterns earlier as just an example. And let's start simple with the drum and bass pattern that just uses kicks, some hats, and a PF snare. As generic of a quote-unquote drum and bass rhythm as you can get. No bass, nothing else, just the rhythm itself. And it might sound something like, you add in hats, be something like, and again, very good entry-level way to practice drum and bass rhythms. They're very kind of simple, but you can do a lot of things to sort of tweak them. But if we were going to take this idea and start building it for speed and practicing it, I don't think I would start from ground zero faster than what I just illustrated. I don't know the BPMs just off the top of my head, but it's not blazingly fast. If we even were to slow it down a little bit more, maybe something like, and keeping it as simple as possible, and just doing that for drills and practice until it feels so natural you can do it in your sleep. The point of the muscle memory is to get your anatomy to the point where you don't have to think about it and you can focus your brain power on the actual construction and how you're going to mix things up. But in taking this idea of incrementally starting from ground zero and building a little bit, what you can do is, and especially with a metronome, I'm not going to, actually maybe I can try it. Let me get the metronome on my loop and configure it so it's not deafeningly loud, and we'll kind of use that as an example of how to illustrate what I'm talking about using actual music terms. So where is it? These are the built-in beats on my loop station, which I don't really use ever. There we go. Okay, metronome pattern 1, which this should be moderate volume. People should be able to hear it without it overpowering me. So according to this is 142 beats per minute. That's decently fast. But if we drop it down to, let's say, 100, kind of a round number for practice purposes. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Still, I'd consider it moderate speed. It's not so slow that it's walking. This is more brisk walking. But if we were to take our drum and bass beat, an example, and say, okay, our starting point, 100 beats per minute, is going to sound like this. How do we practice just the consistency? You would take the click and you do it like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then add in the hats. I keep forgetting to do the hats off the bat. And again, it sounds very simple and elementary, but when you're first learning the Beatbox tool set and trying to build a foundation, doing something like metronome training, like we've talked about in the past, which I should iterate and emphasize more often because it really does help. Because something like a metronome, you can ratchet up or down to increase the speed. It makes it incrementally easier to do that and then still follow an organized kind of pattern and then keep time. So let's put it up to 120. So now we got it a little bit faster. To me, this sounds like more of an even more brisk walking pace, getting close to a light jog-ish, approximately. So with just a 20 beats per minute increment, we take that same drum and bass rhythm, and I ratchet up the speed just a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4. Kind of sounds rock-ish in tempo because we're doing it so slow to start. It's a drum and bass rhythm, but it's so slow and following this time signature that it sounds like it could double as a rock beat. You know, something like a typical rock and roll type beat. But if we ratchet it up further, we're going to jump a higher increment this time. I'm going to go to 180. So for the sake of just illustrating what I'm talking about when it comes to like incrementally adjusting things when it comes to practicing and training for speed. Now we're moving fast. This is a run. Maybe not a dead sprint. That'd probably be like 200 or 220. But you could tell the pace is moving pretty quick. So if we take that drum and bass rhythm and plug it in, I'm going to turn my headphones up a little so I can hear it. Now that same pattern sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. By that token, you can use that again to get used to the higher speeds, and then in your ears, if you're using headphones or if you just have it on like your phone on an app, you're following the click and trying to sync your beat up to that rhythm as fast as possible, or as closely as possible rather, so that you're on time, you're following the time signature and you're consistent, but you're also getting that practice with things moving at a high speed. And even at 180, it's a little bit of a challenge for me to just in my brain keep it synced. So what if we go up to like 230? So now this is very rapid. This is more like a dead sprint. Maybe not running at the fastest human speed ever, but this is fast. And so trying to do this one, the same drum and bass routine this fast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's tough. I think I might be like maybe 10 beats per minute, slightly behind. But to stop that for a sec, just to illustrate the idea that you can use something that has a set rhythm to help practice and help build speed, I think is really handy. And for building speed, starting slow and then ramping up over time will definitely help in the long run. It's something I kind of wish I did more when I was first learning. I tended to kind of just wing it a bit until I start picking up these tips from talking to other people that are out there learning beatboxing. But metronomes are interesting. They're a very useful tool, and they're very accessible and easy to get your hands on. I think on stream here, we've talked about the Soundbrenner app, which is free. You can just download it on your phone. And you can do things like mess around with the time signatures. You can do regular ones like 3, 4, 6, 8, just to kind of hear what that sounds like. My loop station, it does that too. Where is the time signature? There we go, 4, 4. I dropped the beats per minute way down again. But just for illustrating the time signatures, let's see if I can edit it. Yeah, I gotta stop it first. So 6, 8 sounds like this. And it reverts back to the sample beat. But this is what it sounds like on the metronome. It's 100 beats per minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. Very interesting rhythm. I suck at irregular time signatures. The one I know the best, because I have trouble making songs around it, is the 3, 4. So this is double that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so taking, again, metronome tools and using it to kind of learn and train your ear when it comes to the different time signatures is useful for creating beats as well. And just thinking on the fly of how I would do like a 6/8, because I don't know 6/8 super well. Maybe it would be something like a really kind of extended semi-waltz-ish tempo. So maybe something like something like that. I think that's a 6/8. Not really something I'm used to thinking in when it comes to creating beats, but that's probably something I should practice more, just to increase the variation and tools at command when it comes to putting together these sounds. All right, let's go ahead and turn this off. So to loop it all back to the idea of speed, we talked about taking a basic concept and idea, starting slow and building faster. And I think that's going to hold true for pretty much any type of routine or pattern that you do in beatboxing. It sort of depends on how complex you make it. Good illustration would be that drum and bass idea we did before, where let's say we're going decently fast with it, and so our bass beat without any technicality fillers rather, and variations would just be in addition to just practicing getting the consistency of the speed and being able to do it, reliably, cleanly, and etc. You start thinking about ways you can add to that bass rhythm or pattern to add complexity and even to give the illusion of speed, and which is why the technicality piece slots in pretty naturally when you're talking about speed. So what do I mean by that? If we're taking basic thing and then adding in some technicality fillers in between the main rhythm, then it adds variation, adds a little bit of flavor and kind of depth and dynamicness to it. So for that one, a good example might be something like okay, before I get too wild and wacky with it, what I kind of did in that prolonged example was not only add in some technicality parts in between things like TKPs and just simple things that I tend to default to when it comes to technicality, but I also added slight variations to the rhythm, which, as long as you're not doing it every other measure or so and being really chaotic with it, when you take that sound and you start adding little variations to it that augment the sound, you can even switch up the rhythm like you would hear in a typical drum and bass song they do every once in a while. You can add breakdowns or anything else, but if you're not altering the main tempo and instead you're varying up the rhythm, again, it creates more depth and kind of like a dynamic nature, and it's more interesting to the ear. That's the least pretentious way to say it. It just sounds more interesting. Because if you're taking this idea and let's say you're performing this and you're out there and you're just doing the that's well and good, and depending on if you're in a battle or whatnot, chances are you're not just going to want to stick to just that one unaltered pattern repeated ad infinitum forever. You're going to want to sprinkle in things that are going to give it a distinct flavor or mix things up so that the person listening to it has more variety to what they're hearing, which is why I was using things like the technicality breaks, like a drum fill. You can layer in things, again, when we talked about variation in rhythm. So I think what I did was went not exactly what I did, but the idea is the same, where instead of the I changed the drum and bass rhythm to and because it's kind of just a natural progression, and because I've practiced it this way, doing it that fast and at that speed feels natural just because, again, I have the muscle memory to do it. But if you're just starting out early on, you'd probably want to break it down into a slower chunk at a time and then slowly ramp up the speed as you get more comfortable with it. So taking that exact example of the switch up in rhythm, it would break it down at a slower level would be and again, doesn't sound very drum and bassy because it's slow, but you're taking that sort of ground level approach to constructing the rhythm, and then after you get really comfortable with doing it at that pace, then you start ramping it up faster and maybe adding more variation, and you just keep building it that way. And I know it sounds like I'm probably repeating a lot of what I've been saying, but the point is to emphasize that taking something and building upon it at a basic level will make it sound better at the end. as opposed to trying to sprint to the end result and having to clean it up in reverse. And I think that's why, for Collapse and his kind of insistence that people focus on basics and never not focus on basics, I think is really good advice, because it's giving you a good foundation and the tools so that you can master the tools early on and then be able to apply them later with better results. As opposed to the opposite, where you're trying to learn all the tools at an advanced level and apply them, but it's very messy and sloppy, and you have to go back and clean up, and you still have to go back and build that foundation. But if you're doing it in reverse, it's much harder than when you're starting small and then building in the complexity. And that's tough. I know it's difficult to explain to people, and especially younger people who just want to get into the crazy stuff right away. It's like any other skill set, whether it's singing, drawing, dancing, building a house. You don't start being able to fully build a house if you're brand new to carpentry. You have to learn the basics of using your tools, the basics of working with all of your components, like your wood and structure and all the wiring and everything else. I'm not a carpenter, but you have to learn all that stuff before you can get to the final product. And beatboxing is the same way. But the nice thing about the way beatboxing works as just a skill that you learn is it's really easy to grind and practice. And I'm not saying everybody sits there and just does, PF snares on their own all day for hours on end. Most people probably don't practice that way. But because beatboxing doesn't require equipment, it doesn't require a specific type of environment to practice in. The only real requirements are yourself, your anatomy, and an environment where you're not going to bother people, which kind of goes without saying, I guess. I'm not going to soapbox it here, but obviously, since it's like any other type of musical skill, you wouldn't want to practice in a library or in a public, crowded place where people are just going about their day. It would be disruptive and rude. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that. But if you're just at home, doing something mundane, I always give the kind of funny example of some of my best beatboxing practice is when I'm not thinking about it and doing something menial like the dishes, or taking a shower, which is silly, I know, but I think I've done my best beatboxing in the shower, which is not really that impressive, but kind of is what it is. But you can practice anywhere at any time. Hey, Sour Lad's here. What's up, Sour Lad? Welcome to the Jam Stream. How is your Sunday going? We are talking about beatbox practice techniques as it relates to training for speed. And I'm not going to recap the entire conversation, but basically the idea of being able to practice and take ideas and build them from a basic level and then ramping up to complexity is what I've been kind of trying to emphasize throughout the whole discussion today. Sorry, Lad says tired from work. Well, hopefully you have a chance to kick back and relax after a grueling day at the office, as it were. And so feel free to just, like I said, take a load off and just vibe. We'll be talking a little bit, maybe 10 or so less minutes about the sound theory and practice aspects of beatboxing, and then we're going to move into BGM brainstorming. And today, seeing as how we're a couple days away from Halloween as of the recording of this stream, I'm going to be attempting to do spooky type music today. After failing for like 2 streams in a row, today I'm actually going to be making a bit of a more dedicated effort to create some spooky stuff, since it's the appropriate season and all. So that'll be the latter part of the stream after we get through the practice and sound theory discussion. So again, hopefully it's interesting, maybe good background music, I don't know, but yeah, take a load off and just vibe. So to kind of wrap up the discussion about training for speed, I think, just to tie everything together, I think another good strategy when it comes to figuring out how to build speed when it comes to beatboxing is to take a look at what's out there when it comes to music. I definitely wouldn't discourage people from watching other beatboxers and their content, because especially the pro level, you could see some really crazy and impressive stuff that's a good inspiration. But aside from that, because again, that's why I tend to avoid watching a lot of beatbox content now, is because I don't want to subconsciously rip off someone else. Another way to get that research and get that information in your brain would be to listen to regular music. And you can run kind of like a similar risk of, hey, I really like this song and listen to it a lot, and you might subconsciously build it into your routine. So you have to be careful with that. But a lot of the techniques that we talk about when it comes to the instrumentation, the composition, and the techniques of constructing things from a musical standpoint, just observe it in other music out there in the real world. I say that as a person who listens to a lot of music. It's something I really value in my life, and I could talk about it all day, which is not going to be the focus of today's stream, obviously, but just exposing yourself to a range of music is going to give you insight into the difference in techniques and how people create it. And I definitely don't subscribe to the idea that beatboxing is not a legitimate musical art form. I haven't run to anyone recently who's made that argument, at least not to my face. But I do see it thrown around online every once in a while where people say it's just silly mouth noises. It's not legitimate music. And it's real easy to counter that argument just by looking at people out in the pro scene who do it for a living and is their job and profession. And it is more than just silly mouth noises, obviously. I don't have to explain that to you folks. But it's a very different and kind of unorthodox method of creating music, which is why it's so interesting. And comparing the techniques in beatboxing when it comes to making a song versus someone who's maybe using a digital tool set or, something similar to my loop station here, or my synthesizer, you can kind of take a look and see how someone else is using their tools and think, okay, how am I going to take ideas from that when it comes to beatboxing and use it to create something? And you can get a lot of really interesting inspiration and ideas that way. And so in addition to starting with basics and whatnot, I always tell people, listen to a lot of music. From classical music to hip-hop music. I don't like country. It's really the only genre I don't like. But discarding that, jazz, metal, anything electronic, be it like club style, EDM, trance. I could name genres all day long, but all of those can offer something really interesting when it comes to building out your tool set and getting ideas. And so the last thing I'll kind of say before we wrap up and move on is just look at a lot of things that are out there and use that to kind of inspire what you want to create in beatboxing. That's been my approach since I started, and it seemed to work pretty well. And it's kept me interested. Usually what leads me to dropping an interest is when I'm no longer find it interesting. And beatboxing is something that I'm probably never going to get tired of. And it's probably something I'm never going to hit a skill ceiling on either, because you can always improve, learn something new. And there are techniques that I really want to learn that I've been struggling with for a while. I still haven't learned. So it's just one of those things like any sort of musical skill where it just takes practice. And so I think that will do for the discussion on sound theory. Again, hopefully as a resource or just information for people curious about beatboxing, this type of discussion is beneficial or at least interesting. Again, I don't claim to be an expert. I'm not a dedicated beatbox teacher. But if someone were to approach me and say, hey, I want to learn, where should I start or what I should focus on? These discussions on the jam streams for technique and sound theory, that's where that's coming from, just as a way to, again, put a resource out there. And if people want to use it to get into beatboxing, then great. Then that's all that really matters. So before we move on, I'm going to go refill my water bottle, but I will create a real quick loop just so it's not dead silence. I'll just create a real quick loop with beatbox sounds, and then I'll play it back. I'll be back in just 1 minute. So let me do that real quick. Oh, let's see. We did drum and bass, so maybe we do something like. and maybe add just a real simple bass line. It was a good vocalized chest bass. So I'll leave this here, and I'm not gonna make the mistake of muting my mic source because that'll kill everything. But what I'll do is I'll just turn my mic sensitivity completely off and let this run, and I'll be back in 1 minute, and then we will jump into BGM brainstorming. I'll change the caption now before I forget. So let this run, and I'll be back in 1 minute. All right. I'm back. Sorry for the delay. I had to go deal with something else when I was getting water. All right. Let's get rid of this. And we'll save a blank template. And so I'm going to approach this just like we've been doing the BGM brainstorming for the last several streams. I will turn off my mic boosts, and then I shall turn my synth on. It'll be a slight pop. Okay. And then what we'll do is we'll put together some ideas for BGM stuff, and then we'll get back together and talk about it, and then look at what we've done, maybe tweak things as necessary. Again, seasonally appropriate. We're going to try some spooky stuff, or at least spooky adjacent, and we'll see how close we get. So, again, I'm going to kill the mic, and let's see what we come up with. All right. Let me save my work here real quick. Turn the synth off, get rid of the fuzz. All right. There, I'm going to up my dynamics a little bit. The volume might not be exactly where I left it when we started, but it should be close enough. So, what did we create? This one is a little bit spooky, but it's, I think, more sad than anything else, which is not really what I expected to happen. But this thing went through a couple iterations, so I wanted to break that down a little bit here. So we start with the beat. We'll do it track by track like we've done in the past. Let me drop my EQ a little bit. I think it's fuzzing out. So we have a slow, kind of methodical beat, maybe something a little bit dubstep-ish in rhythm. Maybe a little bit too rapid for like a real like dubstep-ish beat. So usually, like I do when I try and put this stuff together with the loop, I'll go rhythm first, then bass line, and then melodies and synth and stuff after that. This one, I started with a different bass line. If I can turn on my synth for a second, it'll get fuzzy, but it'll allow me to illustrate what I'm talking about. So first, the first bass line I put together sounded like this. This is with a piano, not the actual bass instruments, but just kind of a chromatic ascension with like a step up at the end. So again. Sorry. something like that. And it gives kind of like this aggressive, ominous presence to it. But once I started putting together the melodies and the high synths, the choral synths, and everything else that sort of came together, I didn't really like the bass line. So I went back and redid it, and that's how we got this simple 2-chord bass line, which sounds like this. This has a mix of strings with guitar to bass to boost the low end, and synth 329 on the synthesizer, which is one of my favorites. It gives it that sort of 8-bit-ish video gamey kind of sound, like a chiptune set. I call it the Sunsoft bass. And so this became our working bass line. And then third up, we have the first high melody. This is a saxophone run through a bit of a filter. And I don't think I panned this one. In fact, this one might not be distorted at all. It just has a bit of a waver to it, which sounds kind of cool as a high synth. And this sort of establishes the tone, I guess, is a bit more kind of sad or sorrowful, which is not, again, the original intention of the track, but does sound kind of haunting, which pairs pretty well once we bring in the choir synth on number 4. I found that the bass choir preset on the synthesizer works pretty effectively when pairing with something like this. It tends to sound, again, a bit more haunting and ghostly, which is what I used for the Halloween project recently released. A lot of choir synths and messing around with both choir and string synths to create that kind of like ambient, unusual melody, but it sounds, again, more ghostly. And this one is panned, I believe. It's got panning delay, I want to say, but it's subtle. You can't really hear it moving around like some of the straight panning effects that we've seen, but it does kind of sound like these voices are singing from the listener behind. And then from here we have another high synth to complement this one, and this is the 5th and final loop track here. That sounds like this. So it's got kind of a signal sliced beat to it. I use the slicer effect with panning delay. This one does move around the listener a bit more. And this one takes the first melody from the saxophone, tweaks it a little bit, and then adds a little step up at the bottom right here. And so it gives it a bit more of a lead type of sound to it. But the rhythm is different, even though the progression, with the exception of that step up at the end, is the same as the saxophone, and it's not octaved, it's the same notes. It's just a different rhythm because of the slicer, and then the lead in at the bottom to loop the whole thing slightly differently. And then what I did was I messed around, just filter transitions. I don't know if I'd keep that in the final version because I do it a lot. But if we wanted to muffle everything and then pull it back, it sounds like this. And this is a BPF, which I know that stands for bass pass filter. It's in the middle because low pass filter, it gives you much more of a low end muffling and distortion over everything. We take this off. Oh, it's interesting. Putting granular delay as an effect over the whole thing, it muddies everything and makes it sound like it's kind of staticky, but then it adds a delay so it kind of reverberates. Granular delay really messes with things depending on how you set it, but I was curious as to what it sounded like because it's on this third input track. That's delay. That's putting a delay effect over all of the current 5 looping tracks. It makes it sound like it's stuttering and kind of stumbling. I don't think I like the sound of that. And we could slice the whole thing. In addition to putting slicer input or slicer on input specifically, we can have it apply to the whole track too. I've done that on tracks before. It's very noticeable, and I would only do that when I want to emphasize like everything fragmenting for a little bit. For something a bit slower and kind of more moody like this, that effect wouldn't really work too well, but it is interesting to hear what it sounds like. Go ahead and save our work. So that's this one in a nutshell. Again, it's a little bit spooky and unsettling, and a bit more kind of somber and kind of moody and sad, but not. I don't dislike it. I think it's a cool song. It doesn't sound scary. It more sounds like something you'd hear at a funeral, maybe. But how would we perform this one? Thinking about the order in which we would put the tracks together in order to record it. I'm thinking probably the bass line first as the lead in instead of the rhythm. So maybe we start with we could bring the rhythm in next. We'll drop the volume a little bit. I'm thinking the saxophone high synth line would come in relatively soon after the beat. It wouldn't lag behind and let the beat play for a long time, since I tend to run like 2 cycles before something else comes in. I actually want to compress it a bit so that it doesn't follow the exact same progression I do on every single loop track. But from here we bring in the second one, the car synth. Could drop the beat out for a sec to isolate all of the synth and melody parts. This is gonna, in theory, transition us into the next part of the sound, which is the slightly altered high synth, and then the beat comes back in. Or we could have that come in first, which would be different. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. That's not something I normally do. And then we bring the beat in afterwards, after the 5th track gets introduced. Oh, weird. I tried putting in two different filters at once. They kind of cancel each other out. An interesting effect though. An outro, I don't think I'm going to do filter transition for this one. I'd rather just do slight changes to what tracks are coming in and out as each new one is introduced. So maybe we drop for the outro, we drop the beat first, then we drop the bass. Fade out the final synth. And maybe the last thing the listener hears is a combination of the sax, high melody, and then the choir synths, and it ends on that. That would be an outro that I don't think I've really structured a lot. I won't say I'm not gonna say I never have done that before, but it's not common. Usually the way that everything's structured at the end kind of leaves you with one instrument that you hear, and then the song ends. And so I kind of like that idea. I don't know what I'm going to use this particular one for. It might need a little bit of tweaking or some slight adjustments before I actually record it, but I think it's definitely a good start. And so let's save a new file and let's work on another one. Looking at the files, I'm on number 78 of 99. So my loop is getting kind of full. I've recorded, I think, 2/3 of these 70 something tracks. There's 3 that I have to just keep open for other things. But the next time I do a recording dump, I might start moving stuff off so I can create more space. Since I think that the first 40 are from the last project, roughly. But we can see. Okay, save a blank template. And we're going to start from scratch. And I'll go back to the synthesizer. So let me turn it on in a sec after I kill my mic. And we'll put together some ideas. And again, keeping the spooky themes, but I'm going to try and up the energy a little bit. Let's try and go for something a bit more overtly menacing as opposed to kind of somber and moody. So we'll see what we come up with. All right, let us reconvene and talk about this one. I did see a stretch redeem from Sour Lad. Ugh. My back gets kind of sore since whenever I do these jam streams, I'm standing up the entire time. So, what did we make? This one definitely has a bit more of an aggressive tone to it. I don't know if it's necessarily super skewed towards the spooky side, more so than the last one, I think. But just from the rhythm, it has a much more aggressive sort of mood to it. But I switched things around on this one too. You notice that I had an organ part in here, messed around with the chord progression for the organ, and then took it out and placed it with strings. Different strings than we used in the previous one. So let's break it down component by component and sort of see what the result was here. So the rhythm, a bit more rapid, kind of more rockish. Does sort of sound like Down with the Sickness now that I think about it. If there's a little bit more of a variation on the toms, it would be very close. And it wasn't really my intention, but I do like this sort of kind of rapid moving rhythm of this one versus something a bit more slow and plodding. Next up, we have the bass. This one I did not alter after it was recorded. I went for a downwards descending couple steps. It's like a half step in the beginning and then like 3 steps down. Simple 3-note bass progression, but I think the descending melody makes it sound more ominous and kind of more dark sounding. From here, you start messing around with the high synths, and so these I swapped around a little bit. Originally, this third loop track was the organ melody, which I swapped out for a 2-chord progression with a different set of strings. This synth strings, I think they call it. And I think it works a little bit better. It's maybe not quite as forceful, but I do like that you can kind of blend in the background a bit more. The organ one was okay, but it definitely sounded kind of like Final Boss-ish to me when I was listening to it. And then we pair it with the stuff that comes in after the strings. I think this fits a little bit more. So the 4th track. This is 329 again, I think. This one, I'm still on the fence about. It's the step down. I think it needs to be like 1 step up when the melody changes downwards. I think it goes down too far, and as a result, it sounds a bit dissonant compared to everything else. So this one either needs to be fixed or it needs to not be playing at the same time as the strings. Because if we take the strings out, doesn't sound quite as bad. It's still a little bit unusual now that I have the string melody in mind, but when you play it at the same time, it really clashes. So I think I'm going to delete this one out. I need to substitute something else in here later. But the 5th track, now we have an open one on 4, but number 5, this one does pair better with the string melody, and it sounds like this. So this one is a classic guitar. It's like an acoustic guitar, way up in the register, and it's kind of sort of designed to be like a supplementary additional rhythm that just comes in. You don't hear it for a bit, and it comes back. think this one does work decently. I wouldn't change this one. But thinking about a good additional instrument or a melody to pair with everything else is something I'll have to give some thought to. We could duplicate the melody from the strings and put it back on an organ. That's an interesting idea. I'm gonna turn the synth back on and we're gonna get distortion for a little bit while it does that, but I kind of want to toy with that idea real quickly before we move on. Alright, I need to turn this way down or it's gonna be super loud. That's a possibility too. We could also slightly alter the progression of the melody on the organs, but still have it line up note-wise with the strings. This is the same notes. Just a different instrument. Let's turn this off, get rid of the distortion. That's an interesting idea. I'll have to think about that a little bit. It is interesting that once the strings and the guitar synth come in, you lose the bass line a little. It kind of falls into the back a bit. Let me turn my EQ down a bit. I think it's a little loud. That should be a little bit better. So let me save the things I've tweaked here, and we'll think about how this thing would actually be recorded and performed. I think a good strategy for structuring this thing and how it'll be played, especially to avoid getting sued by Disturbed for being too close to Down with the Sickness, we start with the bass line and the rhythm at the same time to start the track. So it establishes right away that there's something kind of more ominous, and you get the bass line melody right up front, and maybe we let that kind of run for a few bars and let it sort of again establish the mood, and then we bring in track 3. And I'm gonna leave, I think in the mix I want the strings a bit more lower in volume compared to what we were looking at initially, because then it doesn't overpower the bass and you can still hear both. And we have the classical guitar run come in. And I think because it takes a break, it backs off and then comes back after a couple measures. I can leave it on and have it just be an intermittent additional little effect that comes and goes. That's just beat repeat. This doesn't really strike me as a type of song that would be structured around a drop or anything like that, so I see no reason to mess around with repeat. Okay, now this is something I completely forgot that I don't really do a lot on the lump on any of my songs. There is a pretty powerful feature here that I just turned on briefly because I forgot it was there. Transpose is basically a key change button. You can set the steps and the key change amount, but this is at 50%. We could do a key change in a song. I don't think I've ever done that before in a final release track. So if we did that, we switched on here. This is what it sounded like. Everything is being scaled up. 2, 3. My bad. 50% is neutral. The actual transpose key is very sensitive. And so here, let's try and kick it on again and see if it makes an audible difference. So key change. Oh, it kind of muffles the guitar a little bit. And likewise, if we go less than 50%, we can pitch down, which I don't think I would do for a key change. Maybe +3 key change. Yeah, too high, too much higher than this, and it kind of really skews the melody a bit. But that's something I will think about for this one. I've never done a key change before, but it'd be kind of an interesting effect. And this is bass key without any changes. We kick it up 3 steps. I'm not gonna have the key change apply to the rhythm. I want the rhythm to stay the same. So I'm gonna take the effect off of the first track, but it is transposing everything else that's playing 3 steps up, which creates a pretty interesting effect. It's pretty subtle, but if you listen carefully, you can tell that the melody changes whenever I turn on transpose. That's interesting. I'm going to save that. We'll save the step, so I don't have to worry about the dial. Okay, so let's take it from the top as far as how this thing will be performed now, throwing in the key change. So we're going to start with drums plus bass line. Strings. Guitar. What if we cut everything out and do a transition with just the first 2 tracks? key change, we bring everything else back in. And now we switch it off. Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure what we would transition to get back to the outro of the song. Maybe we transition when the key change comes off to just first two again. Maybe end with the bass line. That one's interesting. It's got the potential to have some interesting twists and slightly unique functions of one of these tracks. Again, I haven't messed around with key change before, but I think it could create an interesting result. So yeah, I'm gonna save that, and I will tinker around with it when I get to sit down and actually record some of these, which I need to do soon. But interesting concept. Okay. That was two somewhat, I'm going to say, spooky adjacent tracks. Closer, a bit more kind of dark and brooding, but nothing I think would be outright scary. It's definitely looking like, just based on my experience in the last couple jam streams, I can only write spooky things when I'm not trying and I'm not streaming. Since, with the exception of two of the Halloween tracks, which were done on stream, all the rest were done offline, and I guess it's just a difficult thing to duplicate in the heat of the moment. But I'll definitely keep working at it, since trying to create like the atmospheric and unique sounding stuff is what I try and do here. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes the end result is dramatically different than the intent, and that's okay. But we shall see as it relates to future projects. Looking at the time, we're coming up on 2 hours. I could do another one, but that's going to take us a bit later. I've got to go take care of some stuff after the stream today. So I think we will call it there. Let me see who is online, or if the Monkey Mole team is still doing their spooky marathon. They are. So Team Monkey Mole is doing stuff, I think, today and tomorrow. I know for a good portion of today, they're going to be playing some spooky type games. It's sort of like a marathon. And so I want to send us there to spread the good vibes. So let me go ahead and mute this. And we'll go to outro. And we will call that a stream for today. Queue up this stuff here before we go. And I will figure out next week's schedule. I gotta kind of plan around some stuff that's going on during the week. But the schedule will go live before the end of the day today for sure. So in the meantime, thanks again for everyone coming and hanging out while we tinkered around with some stuff on the Beatbox side and on the BGM side. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day.